conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, we'll be continuing our dig into the House District 29's primary election. And hopefully as we work through it together, we can land on who you should consider voting for or supporting if you happen to have the chance to vote or donate into the House District 29 race. But even if you're not anywhere near that race and you don't particularly care about it, don't feel like donating to it, I still think that hearing how we work our way through this primary, how we decide who we should support with pretty much very little information, that's kind of the lens we're using here, can help you figure out who to consider in any of your own local races. Kind of gives you a framework to work through and figure out who's really a conservative, who isn't, who should I vote for. So hopefully everybody can learn something from this segment. Also, with the primaries heating up, we're seeing some interesting ads. I'll go over one of them. But first, I wanted to take a second to remind everyone that if there are races or candidates you want my critical eye turned to, you want me to dig into, especially after you hear me talk through House District 29, finish that out today, feel free to reach out to the show at info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. Or you can head on over to theandrewshow.com, hit the contact tab there. You can reach out to the show that way. That's once again, theandrewshow.com. You can also hit the Listen Now tab to see all the different places you can listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. If you're listening on WZXI at 9 a.m., you can re-listen to it again at 9 p.m. And then if you want to listen to it on the podcast platforms, take it on the go. Well, if you hit that Listen Now tab, you'll see all the different places where you can listen to the show in the podcast format. And I ask, if you are listening to it in podcast format, you leave a review and you share it with others. So, House District 29 is pretty interesting. Why is that? Well, I started digging into it when a viewer had sent me a question about the race, and I said, you know what? This is a particularly interesting race because House District 29 has 6 different people filed running for the office. That's a large amount considering the fact that we have right around about 40 state house races alone where the incumbent has no challenger or not just the incumbent. There is only one person filed to run in the race, period. There is essentially no election in 40% of our house races, but yet for some reason at House District 29, we have 6 people running, 3 in the Republican primary and 3 on the Democrat primary. And yesterday I started to talk about these races and going into why. And the reason why there's so many people running is because the seat's ex-holder, Kevin Bratcher, he is now switching over to run for Louisville Metro City Council and vacating that seat. And it's viewed as a little more purpler of a district, though I still think personally it's a pretty safe red. But it's viewed as a little more purpler of a district, so Democrats look at it as a possible pickup. While at the same time, you're in Louisville where Republicans don't have a lot of chances to win elections, and this is one where you could actually end up in office, so there's a fair amount of interest being shown into it for that reason. And yesterday I went through our 3 candidates on the Republican side's websites, pulling out what we could learn. And those 3 candidates on the Republican side is a Wyatt Allison, a Chris Lewis, and a Debbie Pedden. Hopefully I'm saying that right. It's P-E-D-E-N, so Pedden. And so we went through their websites, kind of drew out what we could, but then today that we weren't able to fully land on anybody. But today I'm hoping with a little bit more research that you could do yourself, any voter could do, we'll figure out who we should support. So we started off yesterday looking at Wyatt Allison's website, and it's just not a good one. For those of you who didn't listen yesterday, I want to sum it up for you as quickly as I could. I would say that the website could belong to either a Democrat or a Republican, and you wouldn't know, neither of which would raise eyebrows. And that's kind of a problem when you're looking to bring in somebody, because remember the position we're in our state house, and this is incredibly important. I was having this discussion just the other day on Monday with somebody, and I said, look, when we have an 80% of the seats in our Senate, our state Senate, and our state house, we don't need more liberal Republicans. A liberal Republican is actually worse for us than a Democrat. Why is that? Well, One, a lot of times, Democrats will vote no on Republican bills. They'll actually vote the same way as the more conservative Republicans for completely different reasons, mind you, but they will still vote no, so that provides a little more leverage. But the other thing is that a liberal Democrat doesn't have the ability to be a committee chair, but a liberal Republican does. A liberal Republican gets to sit in caucus. A liberal Republican gets access to resources that the liberal Democrat doesn't. And because of that, we do have a liberal Democrat on their own will never be able to stop a bill. But a liberal Republican, especially one that's made a committee chair, on their own could stop a bill dead in its tracks. And so that is a lot greater risk to us than a Democrat will be. Now, on the same hand, when we look at it nationally, we don't have a very huge majority in the House, right, at the national level. So if I'm saying, hey, does a Democrat, a Republican light, a Democrat like Republican hurt us or help us more in Congress? Well, you could make a better argument that, well, voting for an R versus a D in that situation in the generals are always going to be better because you're not necessarily voting for that Republican, but you're voting so the more conservative people like Thomas Massey can be on the Rules Committee because Republicans have the majority. You know, you're voting for Jim Jordan's, you're voting for, Comer to be the committee chair that he's the committee chair of, because if Democrats have the majority, then Republicans lose all the chairs. But when we're in a different situation, so depending on your situation, you may want to vote differently. There may be a situation where maybe you don't vote for the Democrat. I would never tell you to vote for the Democrat, but maybe you just don't vote. Because you're like, look, I don't actually think that supporting this Republican in this race is a good idea because it'll actually hurt us for our conservative values and trying to get conservative things done. It'll actually hurt us in the long run. So when you have somebody like Wyatt, who's got a website that could belong to either a Democrat or a Republican, that's a really big issue. That's a problem. When you're looking at it from a primary standpoint, you're looking at it from a political, tactical standpoint, if you're trying to get conservative things done. And so after I looked at his website yesterday, I'd said, well, I'm between Chris Lewis and Debbie Pindon because of White's website. But I'm going to do something, though, today that most voters don't to try to help figure out who we should vote for in this race. And you'd be surprised that a lot of voters don't do this. And I'm going to just Google their names. I'm going to search Chris Lewis's names. I'm going to search Debbie Pindon's names. I'm going to search Allison Wyatt's name. I'll keep him in there just for fun so we can keep comparing it to see what results we get and what we can glean from just a simple Google that can help us make our decisions of who we support, who we vote for, who we don't. And you'd be surprised how many Republicans don't ever, and how many people who vote never even bother to Google the person they're voting for. It's a massive amount. It's a giant number. And you know it's a giant number because when you look at their websites, when you look at people who have hundreds of thousands of dollars of backings, websites, they're bare minimum. They barely exist. They almost just exist to create a web result. You look at their issues tabs and you see nothing. They've put nothing there. No substance, not even platitudes. It's just, here's my issues, blah, blah, blah. And nothing else. It doesn't tell you policy that they put in place for it, why they support it, history they have supporting it. It's literally just like, I'm conservative. And then that's it. That's the whole page. That's the whole website. You think I'm lying? Go check out some other candidates' websites. But it's because they believe people won't look at them. But I did look at them. And Wyatt's wasn't too good, but that won't stop us from Googling him. So we'll be Googling Allison Wyatt as well as Chris Lewis and Debbie Pindon. After this short break, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So we've been digging into House District 29's race. We got 3 Republicans running in an open seat primary. Yesterday we looked at their websites, but today we're going to Google each candidate. So Wyatt Allison, already, he had a bad website yesterday. I went through the litany of reasons why. You'll have to go back and listen if you want to learn it. But let's talk about what happens when we Google Wyatt Allison in this House District 29 race and see what we can learn. Well, first, it would appear that he's a realtor, and he is like 20 years old, or 24 years old, which is like just old enough to run for this seat. It would also appear that Wyatt is not married and has no kids. Not many articles wrote about this race either, so that makes it a little more difficult for us to dig through this in general. But I do want to pause on the fact that he is 24 years old and talk about this. And for me, when I'm looking at candidates, it's not as much an age thing as it is life experiences. I'm a young guy. I ran for office in my 20s, I believe. I was just barely old enough to qualify to run for the state senate when I ran for the state senate, when that was, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And the requirements to run for the state senate are a lot older than the House, a lot older than 24. It's like 30. But anyways, I was in my 20s when I was running. And so it's not a knock on somebody to be young, because I ran as what would be relatively considered a young guy. But there's a big difference between me and Wyatt. I'm married. I have a kid. I own several companies. I employ dozens of people. In my past, before I was a business owner, I managed departments with hundreds of people in them, and I was in charge of budgets with tens of millions of dollars. It's not that he's 24, but it would just appear that Wyatt is a single young guy with no kids, no wife, and a realtor, so I've no clue what his management experiences or money handling experiences or problem-solving skills are, or monetary beliefs. What would that be shaped by, right? Because when you have a wife, kids, and employees, and you're trying to take care of everybody, and then you got the government coming in, grabbing up 30-40% of your revenues, that kind of shapes how you look at the role of government. And if you haven't experienced that, well, you're probably not going to necessarily be as steadfast in your conservative principles. So it's not that he's young, but it's that I don't think he's had enough experiences based upon his bio, his history, what we've learned about him so far, that I think that's the bigger problem than his age. Now, while I'm still on Wyatt, I'll head over to one more place that probably zero voters look at, and that's his donation history as well as his campaign accounts as far as what's been reported. So according to my search on the Kentucky Registry of Election Finance, so that's where you search for any givings that's been given to state level candidates. And then you can also look at the Federal Elections Commission's website and search people's names to see what they've given to federal level candidates. So that's like president, federal senator, congressman. So according to my searches on both those, it would appear that Allison Wyatt has never given money to anyone. And when I head on over to his KREF report for his campaign, what I see when I'm trying to see who's given money to him, well, I see he doesn't have a report filed. Why? Because when he set up his KREF account, he signed saying that he would be spending and raising less than $3,000. Therefore, he would not have to file a report. So in the state of Kentucky, if you're a candidate running for state level office, state house, state senate, if you're going to raise or spend less than $3,000, or also the magistrates, judge executives, judges, city council, they all also have to file a KREF. And so constable. And so if you are going to spend less than $3,000, they make you not have to file reports. And it's reasonable that maybe a magistrate running unopposed wouldn't be raising or spending less than more than $3,000, or somebody who's very safe, not being very challenged could, or perhaps even something like a constable, which is an unpaid position. You know, you could see somebody just spending less than $3,000 for that. But for a state house open seat, not spending more than $3,000, you're not a real candidate here. So we've got a general website from Wyatt Allison that could belong even to a Democrat. That's how much it says nothing and stays away from conservative messaging. You've got a young guy with no family, it would appear, not married, it would appear, and a job as a real estate agent. He's never given to any politician before, and he says when he's filed for this race, he's not even going to spend $3,000 campaigning. So I have no clue why this guy is running unless he just wants to feel special and see his name on a ballot and have people like me talk about him and people like you listen to me saying the name Wyatt Allison. So unless I see absolutely something crazy here as we move on, I think it's very safe to say that Wyatt Allison, his first name's Wyatt, last name's Allison, he isn't a serious candidate. He doesn't even appear to be a serious Republican, let alone a serious conservative. So I think we can cross him off our list. I think we know for a fact that we don't want to vote for Wyatt Allison. Like I said, this is just my opinions. This is not fact. Okay, and these are not endorsements. And I'm not sitting here trying to tell you exactly how to vote, but I'm telling you what I am seeing, what I am feeling with what I'm seeing. And I'm saying, me personally, I would be scratching Wyatt Allison off the possibilities. So let's now move on to Chris Lewis. Let's give him a little Google here. We looked at his website yesterday. I gave him the medium ranking on website. He does say a few more things. He does at least mention the Constitution and a few other viewpoints. A Democrat couldn't slap their name on his website and claim that it's theirs. So you know, that gives him a pretty good look. But when we Google him, what do we find out? Well, we can see from Chris Lewis's LinkedIn that he is currently a legislative assistant for District 22 in the Louisville Metro Council. We see he was also the political director for the Kelly Craft governor campaign. We see that he was the director of communication for Jefferson County Republican Party. He's a part of the steering committee, a board member of the Jefferson County Republican Party. He's also the deputy director of the minority caucus for Louisville Metro Council. Now, that isn't like minority as far as races, like skin color. This guy is clearly white and normal middle-aged white guy. That is not about race, but more the minority party caucus. So they're in the minority because, remember, the Louisville City Council is partisan. It's Republican and Democrat. That's how they run. And so the minority party is the minority caucus. So he's been the deputy director for the minority caucus for like 16 years. And of course, the reason why he's been there for so long as 16 years is because in that entire time, the Republicans have always been in the minority. They haven't grabbed a hold of the majority. And I don't know how you would look at that as far as his ability to have success and other things. He was also a field representative for Ann Northrop. So he's got quite an extensive and long, over 20 years, it would appear, political history. And depending on how you feel about those people that I listed out and I talked about, it will shape your beliefs about him. But I'll tell you right now, typically, not always, but typically, people who've made a career out of politics, they're not normally very conservative. He's not a career politician per se, but he's a career political guy. He's been in and around politics, working jobs, making a living from it for quite some time. And the reason why they're not very conservative, and there's a few things that tell me they may not be very conservative, is they may say they are. Of course, they're going to say, I'm super duper conservative, but when it comes to when rubber meets the road policies, it's just not there. Why? Because, well, they're kind of a part of the swamp. I mean, they've been there for over 20 years, Chris's case. And over those 20 years, how many times has a Republican done something not conservative and he didn't speak up about it? Or he actually would defend it because if he didn't, his job was in jeopardy because he is but a team facilitator. He is but a cheerleader on Team R. He isn't a coach. He isn't a person that's meant to kind of steer it. Those are the people who hold the elected offices. So he just needs to be a cheerleader cheering it on. And if he's had to justify that in his mind because he was working for them, and of course, nobody wants to be the bad guy in their own story, so he's had to justify it. Well, when it comes time for him to make votes, difficult votes, he could be very easy in his mind to justify him taking the more easy option on hard votes where principle and possible consequences to holding on to your seat collide, and he may be more likely to veer away from principle and justify it because he's kind of been doing that for the last 20 years. That's a possibility. And not every Republican, not every person who's been in politics for that long has done that. I'm just saying that is a possibility for Chris Lewis because of his history. And I mean, when you're making excuses too in your mind constantly for people, that's how we end up with these individuals that's just Team Red Shirt versus Team Blue Shirt. If you just want Team R to win, and that's important to people who are, have made a career out of politics, being in political positions because you are either a Democrat or you're a Republican. You are not both. And so if you want to continue to have employment security where you can always find a job, you need Republicans in office and in power for them to give you the job. So you always want Team R to win, because if Team R wins, that's another chance you have at a fancier job title. And so when you are just that cheerleader, you kind of lose the ability to tell what's the difference between a Republican and a conservative. What's it even mean? I'm sure they have an opinion. I'm sure if you ask Chris Lewis, what's it mean to be a conservative? He may list out a few things or be a Republican, but when you ask him, okay, how do you line that up with your boss or this guy who's giving you money having voted this way? Well, he might struggle to tell you exactly how those things align. It might stop him because he has the idea of what is a conservative, but once again, when rubber meets the road, it kind of falls apart. But what do we see when we look at Chris Lewis's donations, when we look at the money surrounding this guy and his campaign in the House District 29 race? Well, we'll have that after this short break. Coming up on a break, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We've been digging into the House District 29 race, figuring out who we can land upon, who we can support. A very important practice as we dig through 3 candidates that have filed to run on the Republican side of that primary. And, I coming into this, I kind of know one of their names or so, but I haven't really sat down and talked to these people. I don't know much about their backgrounds. And we're looking at this as a good opportunity for anybody to see an example of how we should work through deciding who we support, who we don't. How do we tell apart the fake Republicans, the fake conservatives from the real ones? How do we know who would be best for the job with very little information available to us? What kind of clues do we use? What kind of things do we look at? That's what we're doing here. And while you may not live in House District 29, and most of you probably don't, and you may not donate into House District 29's race, and most of you probably won't, even though they do have an effect on you, it's still an important point, I think, for you to look at this and pay attention to what's going on so you know how to vote in your races locally. When you don't know who to vote for, you don't have to go trust other people's opinions, but you can instead use a critical eye looking for what's important to you to figure out just how you should vote in each of these elections. And so looking into this race, we have 3 candidates, a Wyatt Allison, a Chris Lewis, and a Debbie Pedden. We've already kind of marked Wyatt Allison off the list. We've been looking at Chris Lewis. And we've learned through Googling that Chris Lewis is a longtime career politico. He has worked in many political appointee positions over the last 20 years and has been heavily involved with politics. And obviously that can raise some antennae, because when you have somebody who's done that, they've made, as I went over in the last segment, a lot of excuses for bad votes and bad decisions. That's what we've learned from Google. But now we're going to do something, as I did with Wyatt Allison, that almost no voters will do, which is look at their donation history. And for this, we head on over to the Kentucky Registry of Election Finance and the Federal Election Commission, where both websites provide an ability for you to search individuals' names to see who they've given money to, while also searching individuals' campaigns to see who has given them money. And so when we look at Chris Lewis, donation history, this is what we can learn. So he, unlike Wyatt Allison, does have a donation history, and it's all to Republicans, it would appear, which is good. Most of it local elections at the city council level in Louisville. He's really only had 1 donation to the state house before, which is Kevin Bratcher, the race he's running in. But that makes some sense because he's once again has worked in a political appointee type positions within the city council in Louisville. And so obviously those people, he's kind of buying favors, buying their positive attention as he's giving them money. So it does make sense. So there's nothing when we look at the state level to raise too many eyebrows about. And also when we look at the federal level, we see some money to Republican candidates, but nothing that raises the eyebrows too much either. But now we need to look at who has given him money. So far he's raised $42,000, but $20,000 of that, it would appear, he's loaned to himself. And so really he's raised $22,000. And to start us off, as we look at who has given him money, we see on the first page a guy by the name of Don Parkinson. Now, Don, and those of you may recognize that name as a donor and why I'm talking about him. Don is the former chair of the Jefferson County Republican Party, the Louisville Republican Party there. And so I'm sure they're friends. Obviously, they interacted with each other as a part of the party together. But let me remind you, though, why Don, you may recognize his name and why he's on our radar as a negative force right now in the fight for conservatism. Well, Don Parkinson has been running a PAC targeting conservative Republicans in primaries. And the donors to his PAC include people like the teachers unions out of Louisville, very liberal group, includes the horse track mafias giving him money, includes the hospital association giving him money. It includes all the people you don't want giving, you don't want your politicians to be bought by, giving Don money to then go after conservative Republicans in these other races. And so when we see that Don has given money to Chris Lewis, we got to take a look here. I mean, it's there's that old saying, right? The enemy of my enemies is my friend. Well, with that in mind, is the friends of my enemies also my enemy? And Don Parkinson has given him a little bit of money. He's given him a fair amount. Like I said, they are probably former friends, but somebody who particularly is formed a PAC and has gone after and has received hundreds of thousands of donations to attack conservatism. If he's going to support you, I got a lot of questions. Now, there's another interesting donation that's been given here to Chris Lewis. That's from Kevin Bratcher. He's given his money. Noteworthy, as Kevin is the outgoing guy, but it also makes a little bit of sense, and I'll point out why here, because as Kevin's running for city council, he would be interested in getting a little bit of favor from some of those because he's got a primary he's running on. So he obviously wants the Republican city council members to support him. And for some reason, now kind of go into why for some reason in a bit, but for some reason, the Chris Lewis is viewed as more influential with the other Republican city council members than Debbie Pedden. And you may think, why would Debbie be considered influential? I'll get there in a second. But anyways, so that is noteworthy as well. So we've got a pretty lifelong, not politician, but political person who's been in politics. He's made a career out of politics. And he's getting money from people who are, if you're on the side of conservatism, he's getting those Don Parkinson dollars. So he's getting money from our enemies. Mixed with just how tied he is to Louisville establishment as well. Because remember, these urban Republicans, they're involved with the party, especially, they're a weird bunch. Because when the whole Team R just has to win versus Team D kind of takes over, they become Democrat light. Because they see Democrats winning all these elections in these urban areas, and they say, well, we just need to adopt more of those Democrat policies in order to win elections. That's just what we need to do. That's why we're losing, which is a dumb thought, because, of course, if people wanted Democrats, they just vote for the Democrat. They wouldn't vote for you. But with all that in mind, though, Chris Lewis is not looking too great. But let's see if our third choice is any better here, this Debbie Pedden. So as I stated yesterday, I looked at their websites, and Debbie's was the best. And so we can now look to see how she delivers on Google. So when we Google Debbie Pedden, we see that she has AFP's, American for Prosperity's endorsement. That is very interesting to me. Maybe not to the average voter. It's not as interesting, but it's very interesting to me because Americans for Prosperity is, it's a fascinating group. So it's a Koch-funded group by the Koch brothers that pushes on very specific issues that are more liberty-oriented, but fall in line with like what big corporations would want to see. So like if you had somebody who was conservative and recognizes that too much government control is bad, they're not going to go after the monopolies they necessarily benefit from, but they will go after the monopolies that are somehow affecting their bottom lines. And so they put money into groups, and that's what the Kochs do. They put money into groups that to challenge on issues, liberty-type issues that are affecting their bottom lines, are affecting them. And so AFP in Kentucky will focus on two things: school choice and certificate of need laws. Of course, the laws that stop healthcare, that protect those healthcare monopolies so much here in Kentucky. And personally, and this is where I'm cheating a little bit, I know several of the Kentucky people who work for AFP, and they're able to think a little more critically than other run-of-the-mill political agents. And what I mean is that I don't agree with every single person's standpoint. I don't think you should agree with every single one of mine, and hopefully you don't, because that means you're not as much of a critical thinker. You can agree with me a lot, 99.9% of the time, and I'd appreciate that, but you don't have to agree with me all the time. And I don't, it's not that people that disagree with me I don't respect. I respect people who disagree with me, but they're able to disagree with me by not just giving me talking points that are lack all logic or shrugging your shoulders or responding with platitudes about, well, we got to win elections, don't you know? If you can talk data, if you can talk about how conservative principles fall into this, you can talk about the strategy here and how that helps us reach conservative goals, I respect you a lot more. And the AFP people here in Kentucky that I've generally met have fallen into that category where I respect them a little bit more. So the AFP endorsement perks me up a bit. But we'll be digging more into Debbie in our final segment here. Hopefully y'all are learning a lot about how to look at candidates here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show today, but we'll be covering that after this short break. You'll listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you are back here in the final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We've been digging into House District 29. It's been a whirlwind of a show today as we've really spent the time kind of talking through each of these candidates. How do you know who to support? How do you know who not to support? How should you do your candidate research? How do you dig into people? Because not always will Andrew Cooperrider or someone else be able to tell you who to vote for in an election. So you got to have that critical thinking abilities. You got to be able to dig through, the fake smokescreen stuff and get to the real information and look for clues here. And so we've talked through White Allison. We've knocked him off the list. We've looked at Chris Lewis, and we've got a lot of concerns because he's being supported by some definitely enemies of conservatism is what I'll call them, and Don Parkinson and others, giving him money. And he's also been a career political person, maybe not a career political politician, but he's held political positions for like 20 years now. So it's quite some time. So we've been digging into the third candidate, a Debbie Pedden. And we've looked, we're Googling her now. We've looked at her website. She had the best website out of the three. We looked at that yesterday. But we're Googling her now, and we see that she has AFP's endorsement, and that's a positive for me. And I talked about why last segment, so if you want to catch up on that, you'll have to go back and listen or catch the show at 1 o'clock when it comes out on the podcasting platform if you're listening on the radio. But now here's some downside of Debbie, as I mentioned yesterday, that she is a JCPS, Jefferson County Public School teacher. And that can be a concern because, are you going to be for school choice? Are you for all this crazy stuff, or are you going to be against it? Are you going to be a proxy for the Jefferson County Public Schools, or are you going to be independent? And as I covered yesterday, when we look at her website, it does appear she's for school choice with AFP's endorsement too as well. I think they've definitely vetted her then on school choice. That's important to them. That's one of their key issues here in Kentucky. And so now, would you just be representatory though? When you get up there, is JCPS going to be who Debbie ends up voting to represent? Well, considering that the school unions, who have the kind of political control, the money, the power, who kind of represents those teachers and JCPS, their agent in Republican primaries, as I mentioned before, is Don Parkinson. And Don's, like I said, he's bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars from them to go to war on their behalf in Republican primaries. And who is Don supporting? He's supporting Chris Lewis. So that says something about how Debbie might be more independent of JCPS as well, even more independent than maybe Chris Lewis would be, who's getting support from the JCPS Republican primary agent. So, but let's look at her donation records, looking at KREF and FEC. So now looking at that, I quickly figured out something I didn't know before, which tells you, this is how much I don't know about these candidates. I'm just digging into it. Once again, I don't live in Louisville, but this is kind of telling you how much I'm digging through these things, how much I'm learning with you. It appears that James Pedden is her husband, who is also a Louisville City Council member, which is a really interesting dynamic as Chris Lewis works for the City Council running against Debbie. Very interesting. Sparks flying in that race behind closed doors, I would imagine. But the fact that Debbie isn't getting the same kind of institutional support, Because when we look at the money into her campaign, we see that she's raised less than Chris, but also isn't nearly attracting as many city council members to donate into her campaign as Chris Lewis is. And when we look at who's giving her money, we see some other things I'll go into in a second. But the fact that we're not seeing as much city council support, despite her husband having been or is a city council member, and that might point to the fact that, you know, maybe her husband goes a little bit more against the grain. Maybe that means Debbie does as well. But when we also look at her donation records, who's given her money, and this is where I'm cheating a little bit more than the regular voter, because I actually know some of the people that has given Debbie money, and I know them well, and I know where they align. So looking at who has given money to her, I see a lot rosier picture than I see with Chris. Without any further information, and you're welcome to send me any more information you have on this race. Email me at info@theandrewshow.com, or you can head on over to theandrewshow.com and hit contact tab. Send me some more info if you'd like. But based on candidate websites, political history, financial support, donations they've given, donations they're getting, if the election were held today with the information I have, I'd vote for Debbie Pedden. That's not an endorsement. I'm just saying, looking at all the factors we've discussed today, and you all were here as we talked through it, Debbie Pedden is who I'd end up landing on. And hopefully that was useful for you as you look at your own local races where you don't have as much guidance, and you can see how I work through that and kind of maybe help you work through who to vote for. Speaking of who to vote for and not, it is primary season, and we have some PACs running some interesting ads against anyone who the Louisville Teachers Union is giving money to, including people like Timothy Meredith in the House, Diane Brown challenging Doan, Andy Stone, who's challenging Massaroni, Ed Massey's running against TJ Roberts in the open seat there in Northern Kentucky. And as a reminder, the Louisville Teachers Union has given all these candidates like a lot of money, like $50,000 each. So a PAC is running this ad. The name changes based upon the district, but I wanted to let you listen to this little 30-second ad here.
Why is the radical Louisville Teachers Union spending tens of thousands of dollars to support Michael Meredith in the Republican primary? Because the radical left knows that Michael Meredith's vote can be bought. Jefferson County Public Schools have been the epicenter of progressive policies. Transgender coloring pages for elementary students, woke mathematics curriculum, and obscene materials in school libraries. Don't let liberals from Louisville trick you into voting for fake Republicans. On May 21st, vote against Michael Meredith in the Republican primary. Conservatives for the Commonwealth Action is responsible for the content of this advertising.
That's a pretty solid ad, and it does help to call out how corrupt this is. I mean, why would anyone want to vote for someone who's the most liberal group in the state, at least in education, who literally stands against everything conservatives are supposed to support in education, in K-12 education, you know, the group that feels that way? Why would you want to vote for somebody who's getting money from them? I have no clue. And it also makes it clear when we call out these things, it helps to make sure that that money being spent isn't going to hit as well. It's not going to be as effective. But, I mean, we are 3 weeks out here, and mailers are starting to hit in a lot of races. For example, I know in the 45th House District, there's been already like combined, like both sides, like 10 mailers already. And this goes into a question I was asked yesterday about these races, about this spending. And these house races where they're spending $200,000 to $300,000 coming in from, you know, horse track mafias, coming in from the teachers unions, coming in from all these people, and they themselves, and there's a few of these races, they're going to end up spending $200,000 to $300,000. I just think it's dumb. And it's kind of stupid and useless, because if you can't win with like 60-ish money, if you're like another 10 grand past 60 isn't going to make the, like 60-ish thousand is about right. And you can win on that with a good message. And if you can't win a 60-ish thousand and you're struggling against somebody who does have only that money or even much less, you got some problems. I mean, follow me here. There's a diminishing rate of returns, because it's like, what do you spend the money on? When we look at a typical house race, you'll see maybe about 3,000, 4,000 voters, and that will be stretched at the most across maybe you want to target 4,000 households, make sure you catch every single person that may turn up to the polls. because there's not a lot of turnout. I mean, you have to be, remember, you have to be a registered Republican who lives in the district, who shows up and votes in the primary. And so the district is already only a population of 45,000. Out of that 45,000, how many are eligible to vote to begin with? And then how many are registered to vote? Then how many are registered Republican? And then how many out of that registered Republican are going to show up, right? So that's how you end up with only like 3,000 people, 4,000 people on the high side voting in state house races. So if you're going to target 4,000 households, how do you spend that money? Well, mailing is a common way to do it because it's the most bangish for your buck in a way. You're making sure you're hitting perfectly everybody you want to hit. So if you want to send a mailer, it costs you about $3,000 each, 6 mailers at the most to get your message out effectively. That's $18,000. You want to send text messages in a campaign like this, it'll cost you about $1,800 to send a couple of those. Robocalls, the landlines, maybe another $1,000 if you really want to spend money on that. If you're going to run a good digital and OTT campaign, you could do that for maybe another $5,000. If you are going to get outside door knockers, that's going to be the most expensive part. That'll cost you probably about $38,000. $2,000 for a good radio plan. You could spend money on TV, but as far as dollar for dollar, TV is one of the worst places to spend money because, of course, you're paying for the fact that it touches, hundreds of, like if you run an ad on local TV here in Lexington, you're paying for the fact that 50, 60,000 people watch it, but out of those 50, 60,000, maybe only a couple hundred might actually live in your district. So if you've got 73-ish K running, that would be the cost of running that campaign I just went over, and I think that's kind of overkill. That's not much past 60K. What are you hoping to do? So you're going to drop 200, 300K, and what are you hoping to do? Get out more of your horrible messages? People just don't want to vote for you at that point. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.